flight attendant for the night. And
All right, Terry.
we will go live in, all right, 5, 4, 3.
Hello, folks. We're starting our RSU 13 public edition of a board, the budget review. And obviously, we've talked about how this is going to be a meeting where board members are in attendance, and John and Pete from staff. And we're looking at the comments email for RSU 13 to see if anyone has written in any questions for us, and we don't have any so far. So we will continue here for a bit. And is there anything, John, that you want to add to folks right now in this meeting, or Pete?
I'll just start off and say that we set up these budget hearings so that the public could comment on our RSU 13 superintendent's proposed budget prior to the board vote Wednesday night. And we have an email set up. It's comments@rsu13.org. Is that correct, Pete?
Yes.
Okay. Comments@rsu13.org. If you go to our webpage, which is www.rsu13.org, the first thing you'll see right in the middle of the webpage are all the budget documents, as well as the link to the email for comments. And this is a rather unusual setup for us. We're responding to the governor's executive order, which we received last Wednesday evening at about 11 p.m., just one evening ahead of the board meeting last Thursday. And in the governor's executive order, the usual budget validation meeting, which we hold every year, has been suspended for this 1 year because of the COVID-19 restrictions. And instead, we've substituted in this process. Once the budget has been commented on and approved by the school board, it will go to referendum to be voted on July 14. And that will be the process for this 1 year only.
Thank you. Pete, anything you want to add at the moment?
Well, I'll just add to that is that both the budget meeting from last Wednesday, tonight's meeting, tomorrow's night meeting, and Wednesday's meeting are all being recorded so they can be watched at a later time. You can just go to our website and you can find the links for both the YouTube link as well as the live stream link up on the right-hand side of the homepage of the RSU13.org website.
Okay. So any board members, any questions or things you, yes, Doug, go ahead. Nope, no sound. Yeah. Did you call in? Go ahead.
So I do get a couple of questions over the weekend, and one I just think they're probably appropriate because one person
yeah, right.
Others probably have the same one.
Yep.
How much is being saved this year due to the schools being closed? And the short answer is not a lot. Most of our savings are really coming from the reduction of travel for athletics and some field trips, although a lot of the field trips are funded locally through the student activity funds. Most of our spending is benefits and wages, and that hasn't changed. A great deal of our expenditures are maintenance agreements with software and other contracted services, which haven't changed. And supplies are generally front-loaded, so most of our expenses are either front-loaded or fixed, especially since the governor mandated that all staff be paid to keep them off unemployment. And then the commissioner recommended that all contracted tuition also be paid.
I'd like to add to that as well, and that is the schools never really closed. we went into an emergency learning mode where teachers and administrators designed virtual learning opportunities for students. So we ended in-person instruction on March 13, and basically immediately thereafter went into a mode of emergency learning with the staff working, submitting work plans for every single day, and administrators continuing to work full time. So although we did not have in-person instruction, the schools were still open. It's just in a totally different mode. So I just want to be clear about that. It wasn't like everybody just went home and had a giant snow day for 3 months. We've all been working and working really hard.
Okay. Yes, Doug.
So you can hear me now, I take it.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So I talked to Pete early in the day, and the questions I've been getting from the public, I've had this 2 questions, pretty much the same question, and for the purpose of the people that are on the call, other than Pete and maybe the superintendent, the questions I've been getting are pretty much everybody is pretty confident that the state funding will be cut going forward this year. And the question is, why are we submitting a budget assuming we're going to get the extra 1.1 million? So for people who may watch this in the recording or whatever, I was wondering if Pete could explain that.
The first thing that, I want to explain is that getting a cut in subsidy and predicting one, that's us doing that. The governor, the commissioner are all still saying either nothing or that they plan to protect all of education subsidies for this upcoming year. So that's one piece of it. The second piece is, this is the subsidy that they've given us. Right now, this is what we can actually count on it, and we have to use it in our calculations for our budget. But saying that, I think that given the economic climate, because of the global pandemic, that it only makes sense for us to be prepared for some kind of cut, whatever that looks like. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that even though this budget includes that subsidy, we need to operate in a way that questions whether we're going to have that over the entire year. If you thought that you might lose your job in 9 months, you might not spend the same amount. So we need to start controlling our spending now. And that's what we've been doing in terms of keeping positions open and really asking our administrators to come up with more creative ways to efficiently supply the education that we've been giving the kids without impacting the kids.
John, could you jump in and talk about how, because you don't know, obviously none of us know what's going to happen in the coming school year, but we need staff either way to meet the educational needs of our kids. I mean, could you talk about those thoughts in your mind right now?
Yes. So this is actually one of the more frustrating things about trying to plan forward in this kind of an environment, because we don't know what the fall is going to look like. We don't know what kind of restrictions we're going to be under. We're planning on multiple fronts. So we're planning for in-person instruction, we're planning for virtual instruction, and we're planning for some kind of a hybrid model that might flex back and forth if outbreaks of the virus arise and we have to go out, leave in-person instruction, go back to virtual instruction. So it's extremely difficult to come up with staffing patterns on unknowns. So we can only really plan for what we know and then try to have contingencies for what we don't know. Right now, the state has put down the subsidy and the revenue amounts on our ED 279. That's the financial document that comes from the state. And that's what we know. We can speculate that there may be a curtailment, and behind the scenes, we're working on that, trying to figure out what the impact of that is. But there could be other things arise, such as we don't go back to school in person in the fall and we're under some kind of a more severe restriction. And in which case, if that's the case, then I'm going to alter staffing patterns based on that contingency. But to just speculate is really not very profitable for us. We have to plan from what we know and then plan contingencies for what we don't know. And we're doing that. So for those members of the public that question that, I can only assure you that we are working on multiple fronts to the best of our ability to try to plan for those unknown contingencies.
From my point of view, Doug, like I'd love to have a big reserve out of this budget to be ready for big cuts if we get them. But to create a big reserve, we'd have to just lay off a lot of staff. And without knowing that you have to, I hate to do that kind of thing, like in so many ways, you know, for them, our staff, for morale and for kids and what we're going to offer them in the fall. So would it be great to have a reserve going in? Yeah, it'd be fantastic. Now, the other part of that too is for all of us to remember that, and correct me what the number is, Pete, but CARES Act 3 from Congress appropriated, I think, $1.2 billion to Maine for education. And that would be doled out by the DOE and the governor at some point. But it's for like COVID related things. Like if we needed to buy a whole bunch of really great masks for every person, adult or child in our schools, and all sort of COVID related expenses. It would take, I think, literally an act of Congress to change that from COVID expenses, like we would get, again, 800,000 maybe, to like use it for just general costs in our district. But boy, that might fill the hole maybe of revenues that the state isn't getting and doesn't plan to get in the coming fiscal year. So all these big what ifs and maybes and ifs, and just don't know. And time will tell. But I just don't think it's the correct way to go right now to create a big reserve by laying off a whole bunch of staff that maybe in the end we don't need to lay off and they've lost their jobs for months or whatever. You know, I don't want to go that route. Personally, as one board member with my vote.
Yeah, I wish it was 1.2 billion. I think that was really the total amount that the state got from the CARES Act initially. So a lot of that was spent, and I could be wrong, I hope I am, but I think that a lot of that was already spent on testing supplies and some of the medical needs. And part of that was also put into the CARES funding for the ESSRSA funding that will be used by the schools that we do have access to. But that will be really to cover expenses that go along with things like hybrid learning and things that we don't know about right now.
Okay. Doug, yes, keep going, man.
So John, the other thing we talked about the other night was, whether or not we would have to cut programs. And I was wondering if you could address that, because we mentioned a couple programs, and just give me your input about, for the public that might be listening tonight, what your thoughts are on that.
Let me just ask you to sort of further explain that. You mean?
Right. So you mentioned, you mentioned the, yeah. So like we looked at other options that we could possibly curtail if we had these funding cuts going forward. So one of the things you mentioned was about the pre-K program, how we've done the relationship with Penquist, and we've got that up the ground, and we got the federal money for that, and it's produced good results as an example. Those types of things. I mean, I brought up the other night about I didn't mention the Brookings Institution, but that's where I read about it, about possible special education changes that are coming in the law, so we don't have to necessarily comply with what the law says today. Those are the types of things that I looked at and read behind the scenes, but that's nothing that you commented on. But the idea is to maintain these programs while we make some systemic long-term changes to what we do. So that's one of the things Pete was talking about, how we go about that, whether it's insurance or whatever. And it's kind of a wide open question, but I wanted the public, if they review this later, to understand what your thinking is.
Well, you basically just outlined almost all my thinking on those items. But, you know, the pre-K program, I'll go back and talk about the pre-K program. So yes, that's an additional program that's not covered by K-12 public education, but now we do get subsidy for those pre-K students. Several years ago, we got a grant to start up that program. It was over $1 million, which we really never would have got the program off the ground without that money, because it has very expensive startup costs. You have to have a specialized curriculum, specialized equipment, specialized training for the teachers, and we've done all that. In the meantime, we formed a partnership with Penquis, which is running our pre-K program at Self School, but we still get subsidy for all those students. So all the pre-K students are ours. They count on our enrollment. We do receive subsidy for them. And the data coming out of that program has been phenomenal. Disadvantaged pre-K students in that program actually outperforming more advantaged students that didn't have the program. So they're outperforming their age peers who come from a more advantaged background, even though they're disadvantaged. It's amazing what the results are coming out of that program. So it isn't one that I would let go lightly. If we did so, I think it would totally devastate our relationship with Penquis. I wouldn't like to see that happen. And I don't think we'd ever get it back. I think it'd be one of these things that would go, and we would never figure out how to raise the capital to put that program back in. So I won't recommend it. I fought hard to get it in the first place. And in fact, the board directed me to try to establish that program. It was one of the first things they asked me to do when I came on board in 2014. The special education side of the equation, I know there's been a lot of talk about suspending some of the regulations under IDEA and MUSA and others. Those are the laws that govern special education. But the Federal Department of Education has not gone forward with that. We have not seen any kind of guidance coming from them in that regard. So all the laws that govern special education, all the protections are still in force. And I think rightly so. We have a great special education department. It's very robust, but it's also able to handle incoming students and contingencies that we don't know about. So it's one of these things that every year I talk to the board and say, you know, we'd be really making a huge mistake to severely cut special education funding, because it's a required program and we're mandated under state and federal law to provide services for those students. And again, as we should. So if we don't fund it adequately, we could really become, put ourselves in a hard spot. What we'll do if we're curtailed, we'll most likely lay off staff. And I'm not talking about just teaching staff, I'm talking about support staff and perhaps administration as well. And other programs could be severely impacted, but it depends on how much we're curtailed. I really wouldn't know the scope of what that looked like until I was faced with those figures. And then we'd really have to make some tough choices. It's not ever a good situation. I've been through it before in a prior district. It really makes you take a hard look at what's absolutely critical and some of the things that, you know, are wonderful for students, but, you know, they're not absolutely totally mission critical. So that's my answer to that question, Doug.
Hey, Susan, how are you? Yeah, Chelsea, go ahead.
So I have a pretty large question, and I want to frame it before I ask it, because I think the framing is important. So one of the things that I notice whenever I see a budget from Jess Yates with this, is that road noise annoying?
No, it's okay.
Good.
It's okay.
I realize I made a mistake sitting outside.
No, yeah.
Yeah, it's very noisy for me. At any rate, every time I see a budget from Jess, I'm always impressed because if she needs to make a change, she makes the adjustments within the budget to the greatest extent that she can. And so I notice every time I see a budget from her, she's gone through line by line and made adjustments. So that's the context for the questions that I'm asked. But I do have, so I have a lot of confidence in our budget, but I do have a lot of just questions that I feel like I'm hearing some things and haven't quite put them together in my mind. So that's where these are coming from. So basically, we met with special education, it feels like a million years ago.
Right.
But when we met with them, the budget was still in flux because we were adding some positions that would allow us to save money on the contracting. And so what I understood was that we would be seeing a reduction in the budget, the next budget we saw. And the next budget we saw, it actually went up $250,000. So I'm not really sure what's driving those costs, especially since we're talking about how we've built out capacity. Yet the latest special ed budget is at $500,000. And I know 90,000 of that is salaries, but I'm not sure what the other 400,000 is. And I'm really trying to figure out what's driving special education costs. And then I also have a question about the contingency, which we might want to take separate. So,
Okay. Pete, you want to go for that?
I'm not sure I have an answer for that. I'm not sure I really quite understand the question. I guess I'll start there.
I think her question, go ahead, Chelsea.
I was just, so basically my question is that we continue to talk about how we're building out programs for special education to contain the costs, yet the costs keep going up in ways that don't seem to be only salary driven. And so I'm wondering what is driving those costs.
I think it really is just primarily salaries and benefits. Higher education for a lot of our staff that she's hiring was part of it. The speech salary adjustment was part of it. Again, I'm happy to do what I can to cross-section that for tomorrow's meeting, if that helps.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure of the scope of that question either. I mean, the only salaries that we adjusted were the speech language pathologist positions because they were completely out of step with the market. We couldn't even hire those people, but everything else has been a regular step increase for the teachers on the scale. We haven't really hired new positions. We have filled a number of positions that have been vacant, but we haven't really created new positions as such in special ed. I mean, we've talked about this kind of in a more general way, but you know, we have an inordinately high special education population in our district, and a lot of that is driven by economics, low socioeconomic status. I've talked before about how a lot of that is driven by generational poverty, some of it by substance abuse, and so on and so forth. But you know, if you compare our district to say Camden, our special education percentages is double, triple what Camden is, and we're seeing those increasing needs and complex needs in students. So it's absolutely true that our special education costs are going up, but it isn't because we've added a whole plethora of new positions to that department. If anything, she's tried to reorganize and make the classes and the programs more efficient, and I think she's done a pretty good job at that. So yes, it's gone up, but it's not because of new positions, and it's not because we've inordinately increased wages, except in that one category where we had to make a market adjustment. And we can look into that more for tomorrow night and have a more in-depth analysis. If I had it, if I had it ahead of time, I would have.
Yeah, I would appreciate that. Are we saving a contingency for special ed this year?
Right now, there's about $40,000 in a contingency.
Did we spend the 100,000 we put in last year's budget for the contingency?
That never made it into the final version.
We didn't put that in last year's budget?
I don't believe we ever put that in that last year's budget.
Oh, okay. I guess we didn't need it then.
I'll say again that of all departments, I mean, I think she really has a good close eye and a good pulse on her budget. She talks to us constantly about it. And I know, she's made herself available to the board on multiple occasions for, extended discussions about her budget. So, we can absolutely, come back with other answers to those questions. But I think they've quite honestly been answered in the past.
And we
Okay,
did,
go ahead.
we did pull a contingency out last year.
All right. Doug, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to get back on the phone just real brief. Pete, I don't know if you have the slide that's available with you on the we showed the other night about the budget priorities, schools of our future. Just that one slide, if you have that. The reason I mention that is because I think that shows the priorities of what the superintendent is trying to do. And I think for the public that may be watching, that would be, if there's no other slide in here, for them to understand what the purpose of this budget is. So I just thought by putting this up, it would help the public understand, if they review this later, what the priorities are. And that's what I wanted to ask you. Thank you.
Yep, I think a really good point. And the other point is that we started off budget development in what would have been a relatively normal year. And in any kind of a normal year, we'll see anywhere from a 3 to a 3.5% increase due to wages, benefits, uncontrolled costs. Well, that all went out the window with the COVID-19 pandemic and the cratering of the economy and the cratering of revenue coming into the state. And what the board really directed us to do was to try to come back with a budget that, to the extent possible, was a zero tax impact budget. And to do that, we've actually dug really deep into our budget and tried to come back with things that do maintain quality instruction and training, keep kids first, maintain those positive trends for student success that we have seen, and we have seen, increase in our graduation rate, decrease in our dropout rate, an increase in the number of honors graduates, higher levels of student engagement, you name it across the board, we've seen it. When I got here in 2014 and the US News and World Reports and the rankings, I may be off, but I don't think I'm off by much. But I think our high school was somewhere down in the 40s in the ranking, and now we're ranked number 10. So we don't want to destroy the success that we've created, but yet we're sensitive to the fact that people are hurting out there. So we've made tremendous efforts to keep our increase down and to do things that are smart and try to be more systemic in what we're doing and try to position ourselves for the long haul, because I personally don't think this is a 1 year problem. I think it's going to resonate 2, maybe even 3 years down the road. Who knows? But I think we need to be prepared for that. So we're starting early. We haven't had a lot of time to do this. Next year, we'll have more time to plan. So we'll look even deeper into what it is that we do. But I think also the public needs to understand that this has all come upon us really fast. I mean, really fast. We've had to move heaven and earth to try to do this. And we're not alone. Schools across the state are all struggling with this. You pick up any paper or go to any website or watch the evening news, and I guarantee you that you'll hear about how school systems are scrambling to try to ease up on spending for their communities, and we're one of them.
Yep. And that news is only going to grow about schools. Okay. Pete, anything else you want to cover in that slide, or you want to go back to take that off?
I'd say we could go back.
Yes, Tom.
All right, thank you. So first, I thank you to Pete and John and everybody who's been putting in a ton of work on this. And I know that this is an extraordinary situation. But I also just have to say that I feel like we've got to do a little more to make sure the public knows about these meetings. I mean, it was not on our Facebook page. It was not on Village Soup. It was on our website. But I don't think we want to give the impression to the public that we don't want their input. And we're not having a public meeting. And I understand why we can't have a public meeting. But I think for tomorrow night, I mean, it at least ought to be on our RSU 13 Facebook page that this is happening. So, anyway, I just felt like I needed to say that.
Yeah, it was in Village Soup because I saw it a couple of times.
Yeah,
it wasn't
I
a long
saw
article.
Mr. Betts posted it at a little after 5 tonight on his personal Facebook page. I don't know if it was on Village Soup earlier.
It was.
And I don't want to harp on it. I just feel like we don't want people to get the impression that we don't want their input. So that's all.
Yes, true.
But we did, when Steve and I talked last week, we actually made sure it was in the article, the original budget article. There was a link to the public hearings in that.
Okay. That's good to know. I hadn't seen that. Thank you. So,
I can actually go in and write a little blurb on our Facebook page, and that might get some notice.
Yep.
And just paste the link in there.
Yeah.
We usually do paste the link, so I guess I didn't realize that it wasn't in there. But that's easy enough to do. So thank you for that. I'll do that.
Yep. So I'm looking at this superintendent recommended by article summary because it's just an easy snapshot for me to look at. So I just want to walk through that a little bit with you. So the first piece of that, regular instruction, we're less than 1% up there. Does that include employee benefits?
It includes wage increases and benefits.
Okay. So given that, and we know that, obviously the benefits are a pretty substantial piece of that. So summarize how we get to a less than 1% increase with a pretty significant increase in benefits.
Absorbing 6 retirements or 5 out of the 6 retirements came out of that article.
Okay. And so those are being reduced from the budget to not be replaced next year. Is that what you're saying? Or is it just because they're going to be replaced with newer teachers who are further down the pay scale?
No, they're not being replaced.
They're not being replaced.
We don't really account for a savings by retirement because of the benefit question. We don't know what benefits they'll choose. Usually younger take families. There's also a cost. There's usually a retirement cost to a teacher when they retire. So that's kind of where where the budget is not as exact as we would hope, because we know those positions are limited. We know we're not going to hire those positions. We don't know how the backfill is going to look, what positions will be used to do that.
Right.
It could be with co-teaching with special ed. So it could be balanced with the special ed. So right now we didn't reduce special ed numbers of teachers, but we could. There's opportunity to do things between these departments. So the article sometimes might be misleading. we also need to really focus on making sure that we maintain our effort with special ed. There's actually a legal requirement that we have to spend per student the same or more in following years. So that's something we've got to be really cognizant of. We can't cut spending per student basis in Article 2. So we have to watch that one.
So, and that requirement is per student, you said, not the aggregate number.
It's calculated per student.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
I think another part of the answer, Tom, and Pete, tell me if I'm wrong, but I mean, we have a lot more, with some chunk more subsidy this year than we did last year. It went up. How much did it go up, Pete, over year over year?
A little over $1 million, right? $1.1 million.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
well,
yeah.
Assuming we get it, right?
Yeah, right.
Right.
Assuming
So,
we get
but
it right.
this budget is built on assuming that we get it. And if we don't get it, then we're going to have to make some decisions.
Yeah, right now we're getting it. There's no question.
Right. Okay.
Let me just jump in and say, so I was on a statewide meeting on Friday with Pender Macon, the Commissioner of Education, and Dan Weeks, the Deputy Commissioner. And all the presidents of the superintendent regions. I'm the vice president for the Mid-Coast, filling in for the president. And I pointedly asked the commissioner about the possibility of a curtailment. And though she doesn't discount it, what she's saying is the department is going to protect to the extent that they are able, doing everything in the world to protect that subsidy for at least this year. She admits that they might not be 100% successful, but I believe her when she says that. This commissioner is very, very good in terms of communicating with his superintendents. What she did allude to is that the following year, kind of all bets are off. In my mind, that would be the best case scenario because it would give us a year to plan and get ready for that. Whereas this year we've had very, very little time. In fact, even trying to plan for passing a budget, we've just known what the process is in the last week. And we had literally, 10 days, I think, to get our act together and try to put a budget out there that was palatable. So,
right.
Yeah, I sort of felt a little bit better when I got that answer from her. It does give me some hope, but I'm not foolish either. I mean, we could be looking at a curtailment. So it's again, very, very difficult to plan, particularly this year.
Right.
I think that's also why it's so important that whatever the budget number is passed, that we work to make structural changes during the year so that we underexpend it. So we have those structural changes in place as we go into a year with decreasing revenue.
Mm-hmm.
Because the two things that drive tax impact are increased expenditures and decreased revenue. And we saw that last year.
Yeah. But really, no matter what we do, we're going into this year with a frozen budget. Mm-hmm. Already frozen.
So Lauren, I have just a few questions walking through that document, but I know others too. I don't know. Do you want me to keep going? Do you want to sprinkle in some other people? How do you want to do this?
Yeah, sure. How about we, each of us have a couple of questions and move on and come back to you. Is that all right? Come back to you, Tom?
Sure. Yeah, that's fine.
All right.
So
thanks. Doug.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. So along the same lines, I just had a couple things as I was glancing at this really quick. I should have asked this the other day. I apologize. One of the questions we always get is on school administration, and I know that not all the principals are paid the same in the district. But I do have a couple quick questions. One question about administration, then just one observation. So I see that Ash Point, has a little bit of an increase this year, around $13,380. So I'm wondering is that because we're having additional administrative time, or is that just the principal and the secretary or whatever getting raises at Ash Point? Does anybody know that? And the observation I would make is on the transportation and buses. I noticed that for the special needs that went up significantly. So when Chelsea was mentioning about that $400,000 increase in addition to salaries, a good portion of, well, at least over $100,000, $120,000 of it might be right there just in student transportation. So I don't know if that would be helpful for tomorrow's meeting or not, but that would be nice to know, I think. And if anybody can answer that question about Ash Point, I'd appreciate it.
So let's be really clear about this budget. This budget does include all the same contracted and estimated raises for all staff. It does not include the freezes, although the administrators are going in without increases, waiting to see what will happen with the subsidy.
So I'm just going to say that, you know, superintendent recommends any increases in non-aligned personnel. And obviously in a situation like this, I'm going to be holding off on making those recommendations.
Okay, yes, go ahead, Tom.
All right, let me go back here. So just to reinforce, to mention this, but you know, our special ed as a line is up 529,000, but then the transportation for special ed in a separate line is also up 130,000. Right, so that's something separate, Doug. That's not really part of the increase in special ed. That's a different line item. Is that right, Pete?
That's correct. The increases to actual special ed transportation have been going on for the last 2 years. This is just going and getting the budget to catch up to it. We've been overexpending the special ed portion of that, using our vans to take students all over for tutoring in district and also out of district for their placements.
Right. Okay. So skipping down to their instruction, extracurricular up about 10%. Is that what's making that up generally?
Stipends is the most part of that.
So that's like for coaches and stuff, right?
Increase in stipends.
We adjust the stipends recently. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the new rates in there. I can.
So there was an adjustment to that whole schedule
Right.
during the last round of negotiations. That was part of that.
So that's the result of that. Is that right? Generally,
A large part of it.
not down to the penny, but that's why we're seeing that go up.
Yeah, that's about a third of it.
Yep.
And
All right.
I'll take that for tomorrow. If that's all right.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. So and as Doug said, you know, I mean, administration, of course, is what a lot of people look at. You know, and the first line under system administration is, of course, school board up 10% or up 12%, $10,000 is, and what
Insurance.
because we'll get asked why is that?
Insurance.
I'm sorry.
Board liability insurance
Insurance.
dramatically throughout the state this year. Even though our board has not used much of it. Other boards are.
Right. We have to, right, we're part of the pool. So, okay. And we touched on school administration. There's quite a difference at Oceanside High School in town. Is that a staff position that's no longer, or what's going on there?
That's the retirement of one of the admin assistants, which has not been backfilled yet. We haven't figured out how that's going to be, covered yet.
Yep.
But the position was eliminated.
Okay.
Retirement.
All right. And then, transportation separate from special needs, just regular transportation is up 9% too. What's the short story on that?
Say that again.
Just transportation and buses for not special needs that we talked about already, but just the regular transportation and buses is up 118,000.
I would check, but I'm guessing a lot of that's going to be salaries.
Yeah.
Additional hours, overtime.
Are we at, I know we had before all of the COVID-19 struck, we did some work on a transportation ad hoc committee. And is any of that able to be implemented for the new year I mean, I know there's a lot on the plate and we don't even know if kids are going to be coming to school yet, but
Well, I would say yes, with the caveat that we don't really know what busing is going to look like yet.
Right.
Because so I hate to even put this out there because people will flip, but if we had to do social distancing on buses, we could put like 7 kids on one of those big yellow buses.
Right.
And I don't think that's realistic, but I'm just saying that that's what it comes down to in terms of space on a bus. If you've got to keep every student 6 feet apart from every other student.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's tenable, but it's just an example of one of the things that
we have to consider.
Right? Yeah, that we have to consider.
Right.
But absent that, I mean, having a walk zone around the schools, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Establishing bus stops, absolutely. Yep. All those things that we talked about in that ad hoc committee that we can do, if it's practical, we will do.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And of course, we don't really have a dollar figure tied to that, but what we would anticipate it would save something. So.
Yeah, I mean, if nothing else, I think it'll make the bus runs a little more efficient. I mean, I don't see any way that it can't. And that was the whole intent of that committee, to explore all those possibilities. So
sure,
none of that work is out the window. It's just
the
big unknown that we don't know.
Yep. All right, one last one for now, and I see Chelsea wants to get in here too. So the zero tax impacts to our communities is like all in. Does that include our debt service and all of that too?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, okay. I'll stop.
Right. Thanks, Tom. Come back to it if you want to. Chelsea, go ahead.
Tom, since you were co-chair of that committee, the Transportation Ad Hoc Committee, I was wondering if you guys had a chance to talk about replacing buses, because I know we have at least 50,000 in this budget to replace buses, and I'm wondering if did you guys have a chance to get to that conversation yet?
We did not talk about that particular item in great detail. We were talking more about bus routes and also, ways to, potentially, staff differently for our buses. So I guess I'd defer to Pete or John on that question.
We discussed it to the point of talking about the deferrals we've made in purchases recently and the aging of the buses. I think we did get a report from them about the average age of buses. I kind of remember that meeting. And discussing, whether, going forward, what makes more sense, either diesel buses, gas buses, LT buses, and we didn't get into the details, into the weeds of that one.
Okay. Yes, Chelsea, go ahead.
So I know that we're cutting some programs like Leaps of the Imagination and Herring Gut. And some of that may make sense in terms, so sorry, when I'm saying cutting, I mean to get us to the 0%, we cut those programs. And I know some of that may make sense in terms of we don't want to bring people into our community if we're social distancing, sort of thing. But I'm wondering if there's been any conversation about seeing if we could have some of those programs funded by grants or by donations from the community. I hesitate with that a little bit because I know it may not be feasible to actually host the programs. But I do think, I mean, we get those blogs that John sends us with the Leaps of Imagination, and there's some wonderful programming. And I would really hate to see those on the chopping block because I think they're really valuable. So I'm curious what the thoughts have been there.
Yeah, I've actually been in contact with some of those folks and discussing the possibility of teaming up to try to do some grant writing to bring back at least some of those programs, because I hate to cut those programs. I mean, but the financial realities of things here is I have to look for things that really are kind of extras, even though I love them. I mean, Leaps of Imagination is just absolutely wonderful. Herring Gut Learning Center is fantastic for our students. But I think with a little work, we ought to be able to do something to bring at least, you know, a partial restoration of those programs. So we are reaching out, and we definitely are willing to partner with any of those organizations to try to do that.
What about a community fundraiser? Because I do think that we have people in our community who would be willing to fund those programs, and it might be more accessible than a grant.
Yep. When we get there, I think that would also be a possibility.
Yeah, we don't want to lose things like Leaps, forever. If we need to not fund them for 1 year, hopefully it can return the year after that. Programs like that also do get grants from other places. You know, we're just part of it. You know, for Leaps, for instance, it's $12,000 from our end, and they get grants from other places to meet that and match that. So yeah, hopefully we can find some other resources. The other part is, you know, we don't know how much time students will be in school or to be able to do those sort of things this coming year. That's a part of the calculus as well. Other countries are doing, you know, trying different things as they go through COVID, and it's going to be interesting if there may be some direct evidence from other countries and what's been working to get kids back in school and staff in a safe way, and whether it's staggered or whatever.
One of the things that we're told is that the Department of Education and the governor's office is looking at regional conditions. So the guidance and what we're operating under in the fall may look vastly different than what Southern Maine, for example, is operating under, or Northern Maine is operating under. So, you know, if we have low transmission rates or no community transmission, we may be 100% open in-person instruction. So the commissioner tells us it's going to be based on CDC guidance and all that kind of thing. So it would be great for me to be able to say that because right now we're experiencing a pretty low transmission rate in Knox County, that we'll be all set. But I also think it would be pretty naive of me to understand what that's going to look like in August. So that's really the big question.
All right, other questions?
What I would say is too, if board members have things that they'd like us to address specifically that perhaps might take a little more digging, email Peter and I, and we'll definitely do that. And I will post that link on our Facebook page and put a little blurb with it. So maybe that'll get some more traffic.
Good. Yeah. We've got this type of meeting again tomorrow night at 7 p.m. and then we meet Wednesday at 6 to vote on the budget.
Yep.
In front of us. All right, anything else? If not, we're gonna just finish up here. So if you guys are all set, then that's what we'll do.
Great.
It is, anything else? No?
Thank you very much.
Right. Yeah.
You.
Thank you all. It's 6:05. We'll finish up. Have a good rest of the evening and see you tomorrow night.